Hi, I'm Josh Curving, and welcome to another Death Battle prediction video. But first, Gray versus Death. So the fight basically went more or less as I predicted. It did come down to the storm calculation and Commander-in-Chief, essentially. I didn't think there was any chance they weren't going to use it. Basically, like, a lot of the arguments against it, though, are pretty weak. Especially, like, in general arguments against the result being the way it was. Pretty much all of it comes down to people whining that Gray is immune to ice, which isn't a thing. He's been stabbed by ice projectiles, he's been harmed. He was, I think, under the effect of an ice hypnosis ability. Him being, there is no such thing as being outright immune to something without actual hacks. For example, like intangibility, sure, yeah, you're immune to physical damage because you're intangible. Things like that. But if you're just, I'm immune to a certain kind of element, it doesn't really work out that way because at the end of the day, energy is energy. If something hits you and has a certain amount of force, that force is still hitting you. Your body isn't going to just push back against the force and nullify some of it. That's not really how things work. So even if he resisted the hold of the attack, it would still have enough force to just completely one-shot him. So that's basically everything that I wanted to cover for the debunking crowd, which I think is also one of the most toxic parts of the Death Battle YouTube community, is the people who take every opportunity to try to nitpick a Death Battle and pick at the animation, especially for some of the issues that they have, where it's like, oh, they shouldn't have been able to do that in the fight because they haven't said that the animation is just for entertainment purposes 1,000 times already, have they? Either way, the animation was actually stellar in this case. The custom sprites that they had were very, very good, and they moved them in a lot of ways that definitely made it feel more unique, especially the talking animations. Usually it's kind of just delegated to more or less mouth flap animation, but in this case they actually kind of like enunciated, and it was really interesting to see. I'm hoping that they do that kind of stuff for other sprite battles from now on. It'd be very interesting to see. And then we come to Machamp versus Goro. Now, I'm going to be very forthright with my, I won't say bias, because I think I'm pretty good at removing my bias from these kinds of situations. But Mortal Kombat, as some of you may know, is not a series that I am fond of. I actually really don't like it. And Goro is the, I'd say probably third or fourth biggest jobber in Mortal Kombat, only behind like Baraka and Kentaro. And then you have Machamp, who is surprisingly my second favorite Pokemon. So naturally I'm going into this rooting for Machamp. And I think it's generally, like, from what I've seen people reacting to the next time, most people kind of have an inkling that Machamp is probably going to win. So let's break that down a little bit and see how that goes. So, strength. We are going to be using the Pokedex because there is no reason to not use it. One of the big complaints that people say about the Pokedex, so actually the two complaints. One of them is they're written by children. That's actually not how it works. The Pokedex entries are not written. The Pokedex, it automatically like scans what's happening and records it. So the Pokedex entries are not written by them. They are basically it's information that is sent back to the professors, and they write the entries. Like, it's basically shown that like the kids are only really there for going out and gathering research materials. It's the professors who actually do something with it. That's just always been a misconception that's kind of bothered me. And two is the absurd Pokedex entries. Ironically enough, the Meg Cargo one that everyone goes for is not even the worst one. I believe it was Noggin who had a video on why that's not even necessarily that bad. And I think even as of like somewhat recently, mankind has made materials several times hotter than the sun on Earth, and it didn't cause the apocalypse, as everyone says that Mag Cargo would do. And then, so, ironically, it's not even Mag Cargo that's the worst for it. The worst one is probably Lantern. Its Pokedex entries state that even 3 kilometers down into the ocean, the light that it shines can light up the surface of the ocean. Now, physically speaking, that's impossible. The amount of energy that it would take to do that actually goes up to being about universe level. So it is pretty funny how wrong that one is. But that one is not considered... The reason why I think that one is a bit different is because it's not a matter of them stating something obviously impossible. That's them thinking that would be a cool thing to happen and not understanding the physics behind it. Which is very different from saying Machamp can move a mountain with one arm. That's not a thing that you can just be like, oh yeah, he doesn't need to be that strong to do that, right? It's a very upfront feat that like is pretty indisputable if it's been seen. So I think at that point we can use the Pokedex entries for Machamp because none of them are like that. Basically the only things that you need are 2 of Machamp's Dex entries and 1 of Machoke's. The one from Machoke is that it has basically unlimited stamina. It constantly, like, it doesn't get tired. So that's pretty prevalent, and there's no reason that should go away when it's Machamp. So I believe that should be fine to do. And then there is also the 1,000 punches in 2 seconds. I think the calculation for it didn't even end up being necessarily that high. I think it was like Mach 3 or something like that. And then the pushing a mountain with 1 arm. So with those 3 things alone, we basically have what we need there, even though there are multiple other things that you can get into. One of which being that there was there's been plenty of Machamps in various, like, Elite Four, Gym Leader, tons of different people have used Machamps, and competed fairly well against other trainers. So it basically does mean that there is a rational line of scaling for Machamp to other strong Pokemon. For example, it is roughly comparable to a Pokemon like Alakazam, who has an island level feat. And then Dragonair also has, I believe it is also island level. It like made a storm. And it was like really fast that it made the storm. Like it was in like 2 seconds that just all these black clouds just suddenly gathered there. So then we come to Goro. In terms of raw feats, Goro's kind of fucked. The most that most people can give him is even just the breaking diamond thing, which moving the mountain just crushes that. In terms of speed, he doesn't have anything himself, so we'll get into scaling in a moment. And in terms of durability, it's basically that he can take hits from other characters that can do the diamond feat. This is kind of what I mean by Goro being a jobber. He typically only exists to show up and lose, which is ironic considering his like 500 years of experience of being undefeated in the Mortal Kombat tournament. So you'd think he would be a lot more successful in the current ones, but ironically not. So then you come to the question of what can Goro scale to? And this is a lot harder of a question to answer because of the different interpretations of it. Basically, some people try to scale him around Shang Tsung by basically just the fact that Shang Tsung was basically glad to have him on his team. So they scale him to the Shaolin monk's feet, where he held up an island. There's a couple issues with that. One of which is that I believe Shaolin monks is also non-canon, which is also where both Liu Kang and Kung Lao were required to beat Goro. So I'm not sure if using Shaolin monks is valid, but let's assume it is for now. That would be about. I don't actually think that lifting an island is island level, but I don't recall actually exactly what the numbers would be for that. But either way, scaling to lifting up an entire island. And then some people try to scale him to Kotal Khan, because he fought him before Goro had all of his arms ripped off. And Kotal Khan specifically has a light-based attack, so some people would basically argue that the bit that his head moves during that attack, while the light moves, would be relativistic. I think it came out to 40% the speed of light or something like that. And then Kotal Khan scaling to Shao Kahn, who some people argue from being anywhere from planet level to universal. So naturally that means that there's a lot of wiggle room in terms of what Death Battle might use here. But the thing that at the end of the day that I will kind of go into is that it doesn't ultimately matter as long as it is even. As long as both sides are being given comparable scaling, it doesn't matter what they end up using. Machamp probably claps. So let's assume that they do use things like Shaolin monks and do scale up to characters that it's questionable whether they're actually comparable to, or if they just had a fight with them and lost. So if you give the same level of scaling to Machamp, then you have, say, non-canon material such as Mystery Dungeon, where Machamp is capable of beating the shit out of both Rayquaza immediately before it blasts a Hyper Beam at a meteor that was capable of causing natural disasters months before the meteor was even in sight of Earth. So that alone is, I believe, large star level, so that crushes the planet level aspect of it. So that would mean that the only way that you could argue that Goro could win is if universal. But even then, you still get the fact that Machamp is capable of killing dark matter from Super Mystery Dungeon, which was capable of one-shotting Arceus. And again, if we're going too much into Mystery Dungeon specifically, there are a lot of times in which Pokemon who are not legendaries have completely bodied other legendaries. Like in the Adventures manga, there was an instance where a Dragonite and an Ursaring and a Swinub, yes, a Swinub, like the pre-evolution to Piloswine, were capable of fighting back and defeating Dialga, Palkia, and Giratina. So it was a 3-on-3, and this little Swinub beat Dialga. So in terms of that, if you were to just say this, like the first out of 3 evolutions, and say that Machamp should not be comparable to it, that's pretty wrong. Like, I would think that it would be pretty easy to say that Machamp should be one of the stronger Pokemon, especially because fighting types often have the best physical feats. And then you also have the fact that Pokemon is kind of treated a little bit strangely in the Versus community just because of the fact that there are all of these legendary Pokemon, most of which are required to be fought, but no Pokemon in the game really get that scaling because of the fact that it's unknown what Pokemon you're going to be using. So ultimately, I do think that it is a hard question to answer. I don't think there is a very good answer for it. Both extremes kind of fall onto being wrong. Like, for example, if you face Team Rainbow Rocket in Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, and Cyrus has Palkia or Dialga, depending on which one you're playing. So this is not an optional fight. So Elias, who is the default main character of Sun and Moon, Elias's team must be universal in order to actually fight this Dialga or Palkia. But no individual Pokemon can actually be given that scaling, weirdly enough, because we don't know what would be on his team. So it comes down to a situation where your options are either no Pokemon receive the scaling, which we know is flagrantly false because of the fact that obviously he had Pokemon on his team that beat this legendary, or all Pokemon receive the scaling, which is also pretty... I don't necessarily know if it's wrong to do, but it sets a really bad precedent where you can basically make the argument that a Sunkern is universal. I don't agree with that either. The best that I've been able to work up in terms of actually being a rational argument is that you could potentially scale all final stage Evos to universal, which is, again, really shaky. But again, about as shaky as getting Goro up to there as well. So that's basically what I mean, is I don't necessarily think that Pokemon like Machamp are universal. I don't necessarily think that, though I do go back and forth on that at times. But at the end of the day, no matter how far you try to push Goro up, if you just apply the same things to Machamp, it gets him higher. Let's even break it down a little bit further and assume that both of them are identical in stats. They're both relativistic and universal. Oh, relativistic for Machamp coming from attacks like Doom Desire that specifically attack using sunlight. There was a calculation someone did with a Poliwrath that intercepted a Doom Desire, and the calculation for it came out to being about 40% the speed of light as well. If I recall, a touch lower than Goro's, but for the sake of this discussion, let's just make them perfectly even. So you would still have Machamp ultimately win. So Goro is a master of 3 martial arts. One using his weapons, which are these like claw things that come off from the back of his arms, all 4 of them. The second one is like a Shokan fighting style, and the third one is like a deviation of that. Machamp, meanwhile, is a master of all martial arts in the Pokemon universe, which, considering we have like Karate Guy and things like that, we can assume that there aren't too many different martial arts than we have in real life. Which basically means that Machamp is like Batman. He's just mastered all of those martial arts. So Goro's experience doesn't end up meaning very much, just because of the fact that Machamp has so much experience with so many martial arts, even if they are martial arts that are not particularly applicable to... if there are martial arts that are not applicable to Pokemon, such as the Shokan fighting style, it doesn't necessarily mean that he wouldn't have experience against it, if that makes sense. So, martial arts, especially because of the fact that these are martial arts from another universe, there would likely be a lot of overlapping moves and ways that things work. And with knowledge of that many martial arts, he would pretty much be able to kind of understand what's going on. And that's besides the fact that it doesn't end up meaning very much, because the specific moves that Goro uses are very easily countered by Machamp. Like, for example, if he has these shock waves that he can do, which would be covered by Wide Guard. If Machamp uses Knockoff, he can get rid of the weapons and do extra damage in the process for it. Machamp can confuse him with Dynamic Punch. If he flinches, he would get a speed boost with Steadfast. With Guts, if he's burned by Goro's fireballs, he gets stronger. And there were other ones too, if I recall. He can decrease Goro's stats with things like Scary Face. He can increase his own stats with things like Bulk Up. He can inflict statuses using Thunder Punch for paralysis. Um, and then it's frozen with Ice Punch, though frozen never works. Frozen never works for very long. And then burning him with Fire Punch. So he does have several attacks that can... Oh, and then Confusion, and then he's got Encore as well. And Encore, if you actually apply the idea of it to a real fight, it's kind of broken. Can you imagine being in a fight with someone, they throw like a big punch, and then you're just like, yeah, you're going to do that exact punch 3 times in a row now. That's pretty easy to capitalize on. So it is pretty... Machamp has a lot more hacks and abilities than Goro does. And the abilities that Goro does have are just shut down completely. So I think at the end of the day, it is pretty obvious that Machamp wins no matter what's used. I'm just really looking forward to this animation. It's going to be pretty exciting. So that's basically all I've got to say for this one. I will see you guys for the next one. Oh, now I'm hoping this is going to be fun. I'm hoping that they use my pun for the pun at the end of the episode, with basically that Machamp winning as a foregone conclusion. I'm hoping they use that. Just because I only say that because when they did this as a community death battle a while ago, it was ultimately it was my verdict that they actually picked from Twitter to use, and that was the pun that I used. So I'm kind of hoping that they use it. I will be a very happy camper if they do. But yeah, I will see you guys after the next one.